This is a response to a question sent in to AskProfWolff from our Patron community. I'm Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work. Actually, I'm responding today to two questions. One sent in from the United States from Barbara Witt, and the other one from New Zealand, where we have a new Patreon member, Nick Taylor by name. And both of them are asking about housing, about investment in housing, and one of them is noticing the rising rents and higher prices in Oakland, California, and the other one is noticing pretty much the same thing far across the world in New Zealand. So I thought I'd put them together and try to respond to both of them. First, let's talk about investment in housing. There was a time, quite a while ago, when most houses in the United States and in many other parts of the world were basically of two kinds. Single family, sometimes double family housing, owned, operated, and lived in by the same people, on the one hand, and on the other, what we call multifamily housing, apartment houses, called here in the United States, many units in one building with people renting the space in them. All that has changed in recent decades so that we have all kinds of changes. For example, apartments that were once rented are now owned as either condominiums or co-ops. That's their names here. They have comparable names in other countries. We also have a growing investment housing. That's when hustlers on Wall Street and places like that, financiers, collect money from rich people in order to buy huge numbers either of houses, self-standing single-family houses, or multiple apartment units, and operate them like any other investment, squeezing the maximum amount of profit as is possible by scrimping on the maintenance, scrimping on the quality and quantity of the building, of the appliances, and so on the one hand, and getting as much rent as possible on the other, or selling them in some cases with the same profit in mind. On that basis, then, let's look at the questions. Why are rents rising? Why are home prices rising? Well, then the answer becomes simple. In the case of investment-owned housing, which a lot of this is, that's simply profit maximization. You economize on costs, and you squeeze out the highest possible prices and or rents. And don't be misled by the attempt to fool you by telling you about basic economics. For example, and this is the most standard nonsense that I keep encountering. Gee, don't be upset about high prices or high rents because they operate as an incentive so that builders and investors will produce more of these high-priced units, and that will do away with the shortage, and that will bring the prices and or the rents back down. This is really stupid, because if it's a simple law of economics, you can be very sure that the investors, the home builders, the banks who lend, they all have seen that story too, and they understand perfectly well that if they increase supply to take advantage of the high prices and high profits, they will be killing the goose that lays the golden egg. That is, they'll be doing away with the very conditions that give them high prices and high profits. So guess what, kids? They don't do it. They hold back supply. They don't build. They don't invest more because they understand perfectly well, especially in housing markets that have only a few builders or a few investors that are concerned with them. They want to protect their advantages. They want to protect their quasi-monopoly situation, so they maintain the conditions. They do not do what the economics textbooks would like to imagine that they do. And be aware that in cases where you can see a big building boom following a situation in which there was shortage of housing and high prices, that what you're likely observing is a rush for builders to take advantage of the housing shortage and the high prices that have kept particularly minority groups or young people entering the housing market, kept them away from being able to afford good housing. To come in, they build quickly, they build poorly, they build cheaply in order to take advantage of a kind of desperate demand of people who buy a house and only then discover that the pipes aren't adequate, that the walls don't suffice, that the electricity was done in a slapdash fashion, and so on. You know why that happens? Because the same capitalist profit focus is at work. Let me take a step back and look at this from a more theoretical, comprehensive perspective. A test of any economic system is how it provides the basic food, clothing, and shelter, that's housing, to the people who live in it. Are people given jobs and incomes sufficient to purchase the food, clothing, and shelter that's sufficient for a decent life? A successful economic system does that. A successful capitalist system gives people enough jobs and incomes to afford the food, clothing, and shelter they need. A failed capitalist system is one who cannot do that, who either gives income and jobs that are insufficient or charges too much for the food, clothing, and shelter that the working class has to be able to buy. If you see homelessness, if you see unaffordable housing, that is housing that takes more than 25%, give or take, of incomes on average, you're observing a failed economic system. Capitalism is a system that produces artificial shortages in order to maximize profits. And the sign of that is unaffordable rent, unaffordable housing, and that's what we're getting, whether it's in Oakland, California, or New Zealand on the other side of the world, and in very many places in between.